Welcome, Crater fans. This is a talk from Crater Remote Conf Mobile Edition. This talk focuses on building mobile apps using JavaScript. You can find out more information about upcoming Crater Remote Confs at conf.crater.io. Enjoy the talk. So our first speaker is Bonnie Eisenman, and she has actually written a book on learning React Native. And so we've had her on the Space Dojo show before, and I'm pretty excited. She's going to tell us about the impact of React Native. So welcome, Bonnie.
Hey, good morning.
All right. Well, I'll let you get into the talk.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks so much for having me here. So hi, everyone. I'm going to turn on screen sharing so you can see my slides. So let's get started. So before we begin, I just wanted to tell you all a little bit more about myself so you know where I'm coming from. I'm a software engineer at Twitter New York. And I've been doing stuff with React and with React Native for a little while now. And it's stuff that I am really excited about, really interested in. And so as you've already heard, I'm the author of Learning React Native, which is a book published by O'Reilly that came out in early 2016. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how React Native can be great for mobile development. If you have more questions, you can follow up with me on Twitter. I'm at Brindell. That's probably the best place to reach me. So let's get started. Today, I said I was going to talk to you all about the impact of React Native. And I know that this conference is focused on mobile, and there's a strong focus on React Native, but I wanted to talk about sort of how React Native can fit into the bigger mobile ecosystem, right? In what context did it emerge, and how does it change the way we think about mobile development? Why does it matter? So in order to talk about that, we have to start by talking about mobile in general. And so I'm going to rewind a little bit if we skip back a couple of years. So this is a graph, and I want showing different amounts of time spent on screens, right, by device type. So I want to draw your attention first and foremost to 2014, because 2014 is when we reached this really interesting tipping point. If you've been doing mobile dev, you're probably pretty convinced that mobile matters, that mobile is important, but this is where we sort of start getting data to really back that up. So these are just numbers for the US. Obviously, that's a small segment of the global market, but is fairly representative in terms of smartphone usage. And starting in 2014, we see that mobile is now taking up the majority of people's screen time, not counting the television, right? So more than desktop. And what this means is that mobile is really the primary screen where your users are at. It's not like this weird little stepchild of a platform that you might worry about. You really need to be mobile first, not in the cliched form of that term, but like seriously, if you want your business to succeed. So mobile is now the primary screen for our users. This is super important. And yet mobile development is really hard. Mobile development is a much younger field than traditional desktop-based software development. There's a lot of stuff going on that is not quite ideal. So if we think about how mobile development traditionally works, and traditionally with air quotes, right? Because this is a pretty new stuff. There's a lot of platform-specific arcana. So if you're working on iOS, you need to be learning Objective-C or Swift, which came out in June 2014. If you're on Android, you need to be learning Java. But even beyond just the language, you need to be spending a ton of time focusing on the intricacies of how these platforms work, what their APIs are, all of this stuff. And you're going to build up a lot of deep expertise. And yet that knowledge is really siloed. So if you're a senior iOS developer, you probably don't really collaborate with senior Android developers. You probably don't share that knowledge. You probably don't have a lot of crosstalk. And for businesses especially, or for anyone who wants to have their app available on iOS, Android, and mobile web, this means that you do a ton of extra work. You basically have to build your app 3 times. And I don't know about you, but I find programming interesting when I'm building new things, not when I am just copy pasting essentially functionality. And that duplicated effort can really, really feel like you're just burning cash. It's not ideal. Nobody really likes the setup. And again, taking the lens, if we look at the state of mobile development in 2014, there's not a ton of great alternatives. So there is some prior work in this field of people trying to make mobile development better. We heard for a while people talking about HTML5, as the great thing, right? Because we already know how to make awesome web apps with HTML and JavaScript and all this. So why don't we just bring the web to phone? Which leads to one of my favorite quotes. This is from 2012 from Zuckerberg, saying that the biggest mistake we've made as a company is betting on HTML5 over native. So this is at a point where mobile web is like this great idea in theory, but what we see is that there's like, it's just not there, right? It doesn't deliver the same experience to our consumers. And mobile's the primary screen, so we have to have a top of the line experience for them. And so HTML5 doesn't work. And there are some attempts at cross-platform development. I'm going to get into that in a sec. But now if we skip ahead to React Conf, so this is the first React conference. It takes place in January 2015 at Facebook HQ in California. And Facebook announces this thing called React Native. So remember, we're stepping from their first attempts at trying to bring the web to mobile and failing by their own exec's account, to this new thing called React Native. And what React Native promises us is that it's going to try and solve these problems with mobile development. So it claims that you're going to be able to learn once and write anywhere. Once you learn how to use React Native, you'll be able to write on iOS and Android. And you'll be able to do that in JavaScript using the React framework. And, which is the real kicker, it says that you're going to get native level performance. This is the holy grail, right? People would love to be able to write the same code, have it run on iOS and Android, to be able to work as one team instead of 3 separate developer silos. This would be great. And this is what React Native is promising. Again, we're sitting in the beginning of 2015 here. The audience reacts. The audience gets really, really excited. This is a big, big claim. And I was talking to one of the team members at that conference, and I don't remember who, but someone said to me, you know, it's not interesting that we're trying this. What'll matter is if we get it right. And this is very true. There's a lot of prior work here, but all the prior work has sort of been plagued by a couple of problems. So the hype train kicks off, but we've tried this before. And cross-platform mobile development, whether we're talking about like Cordova or Titanium or Xamarin, or there's a bunch of other existing frameworks that have tried to do these things, there's sort of some persistent problems. So keeping up with API changes is hard. What happens when the underlying OS updates and suddenly things are a bit different? How quickly can you respond to breaking changes? Can you keep up with mobile level performance? What about your animations, your look and feel? Do you have to mimic those, or can you leverage the real ones? What about your developer experience, right? Like, is it actually going to take me 10 times as long to compile my app because now I have this really complicated tool chain? Can I use existing third-party libraries? How does all of that work? And I think in practice, it's a slow accumulation of things being just not quite good enough that keeps a large number of people from adopting existing cross-platform mobile development solutions. So these are the things that we should always be keeping an eye on when someone promises us cross-platform mobile development, right? These are some of the things that are the easiest to screw up, the harder problems to solve. So what's different this time, right? Why do people actually think that React Native stands a chance? So React, the JavaScript framework for writing UIs, happens to have this really nice feature, which is called the virtual DOM. So when something changes, what you do is you tell React that something has changed in your application. React says, okay, cool. It computes how your app should render differently based on it. And it builds that representation up in memory, and then it re-renders it to the browser DOM. So there's this very clean separation in React between how you tell React your application should look and then the actual work of rendering it. So you have this super clean abstraction layer, which means, of course, that you don't need to render to the DOM at all. And React Native, it literally just works by taking React's internal representation of how your application should look and then interacting with the actual native APIs on iOS or Android or whatever other platform you're on. And you know, this might sound like a little bit vague and like, why do you really care about the plumbing underneath of it? But this is actually the key to why React Native has been able to tackle those really big problems, right? Because we're no longer doing what a lot of other solutions do, which is take a web view, maybe add some custom hooks on top of it, but fundamentally expect you to write a website and package it as an app. We're also not forcing you to use some totally different toolchain. React Native just uses the mobile platform's actual JavaScript engine to do the React bit of your code. And then it's got this bridge. And the bridge has to have as much SDK coverage as possible to try and communicate between, say, iOS and Android layout APIs and React's internal representation. All right, and what we get from this is that React Native is actually native. And the abstractions we use to talk about the different layers of your app should actually be understandable by any developer working with React Native, even if you've never touched Objective-C before, even if you've never touched Java before. You shouldn't have to go into those languages, but you can read them when you need to. You don't get boxed in by the limitations of the framework. You can actually dip down and write native code if you have to. So this is a huge promise, right? It's a big idea. And Facebook releases React Native on GitHub early as an alpha release to everyone who attended that conference. And again, it's not interesting that they're claiming that they'll be able to do this. What matters is really how does it actually work? And this is sort of an era in which the hype train is building. So people pass around flash drives with the React Native source code and invite each other to try it. Because originally they only give access to a few hundred people, and that does not last very long. And so I was actually at the time a software engineer at Codecademy. And we had our designers sort of spec out what a quiz app might look like if we decided to, say, build flashcards to go along with a course. And so what you can see on here is on the left is the design block provided, and on the right is an iOS app running in a simulator. So I decided to take 2 days at Codecademy and see how far I could get. As an engineer with plenty of experience with React, and having done, some professional iOS and Android development, but not a lot, and not actually making use of that knowledge at all, how far could I get in 2 days? And the answer was surprisingly far. In 2 days, I made a mock flashcard app that actually, worked and rendered in this super new, super janky library that had been released. And at the time, I wrote about it and I said, this feels just like web development, but it's targeting a different platform. And this, I think, was for me really key, because when I had done other kinds of app development before, it always felt very frustrating, right? You want to change one pixel, so you have to rebuild your entire application, so you wait a full 20 minutes, and then you have to go talk to the person who's working on the other platform and try and get them to update it. When you're working with React Native, you save your code, you hit refresh, and you watch in the simulator as the updates populate. That is huge. And especially if you've already done web development, you're going to find that React Native feels very, very comfortable. It's really similar. And so Facebook releases this thing. They give it to us. It goes fully open source. And what we see is that people slowly start to poke at it and try to assess whether or not it actually meets their needs. Is this thing for real? And so, people basically spend a few months tinkering with it, attempting to do things with it, trying to figure out if it's a good fit. And then September, we start to see a lot of talking about it as people slowly start to post publicly about these things. So a few of my favorites, this is a screenshot of a Medium article by Clay Alsop called React Native in Production. And React Native helped us ship crucial features in less time and immediately increase the percentage of our team that contributes iOS code. That's his assessment of it. And I believe that he's talking about the team at Palantir. So this is pretty awesome, right? Like that right there, that is indeed the entire sales pitch in one sentence. Keep in mind that at this point, React Native is just for iOS. They haven't released Android yet. We also get iOS developers who initially go, why on earth would I want JavaScript in my code base? Ew. We still get a lot of iOS developers who are very curious about this new thing, who want to know what people are talking about, who try it out. And surprisingly, we get some pretty good feedback, right? So in this article, the quote is, fast forward a couple of months, and I'm confident enough to say I may never write an iOS app in Objective-C or Swift again. So React Native is really winning people over. It's doing this mostly because it's really fast to work in and because React is really nice to work in, right? For the same reasons that React has sort of won over a lot of people in JavaScript. People like the way that you structure your code with it. People like the way it solves problems. We also finally get to the Android release. And so this is sort of the big turning point, right? If you really believe that React Native is going to help you write cross-platform applications, it needs to be cross-platform, not just in theory, but in practice. So Android release drops. At the time I was working on the book, and I had built a application as sort of the capstone project for the book, and had built it with the iOS version of React Native. And I tweeted out at the time that I had built a React Native app for iOS before the Android release, and then I updated React Native, and the Android build worked on the first try. React Native is probably the only time I've used a framework where you can accidentally write a cross-platform application. That's a pretty magical moment. And I think it's hard to overstate how important that is. When you use React Native, you don't really have to think about your platform. You can, and if you want to really get into the detailed interactions, you probably should. But there's something awesome about being able to just say, hey, I'm going to write a mobile app, and it's going to behave like a mobile app and expect it to work. So that was a really exciting moment. And so if we look back at what React Native is promising, it's claiming that we're going to be able to learn once and write anywhere, that we'll be able to write JavaScript that runs on both iOS and Android, and that we'll get native level performance. And so again, September 2015, after Android comes out, it looks like we've arrived, right? You can use the same knowledge base you have with React Native for iOS and apply it directly to React Native for Android. You can use the same code base. You get native level performance. React Native is actually invoking native APIs instead of mimicking them. So what you get is actually almost equivalent to developing on mobile in the traditional way. Sure, there are occasionally complications, but in general, it's pretty great. And so it starts to look like React Native has actually met this promise. And if we skip ahead to the present day now, I want to talk about where we stand. So first of all, React Native is on far, far, far more platforms. So we see from the last conference, we heard that Microsoft was announcing Windows support on React Native. And also that Samsung was going to support it on their platform. So you can now write React Native for your smart TVs, for your Windows laptops and Windows phones, for your Xbox. All this stuff is coming. And this is really, really cool. We also get over-the-air updates. So, React Native is a JavaScript thing. Your application can be represented largely or entirely in JavaScript. And so what we start to see is that you can actually just ship a new JavaScript bundle and update your app without going through the App Store review process. If you've done iOS development before, this is huge. The iOS review process, typically on a good day, if the fortunes are right, if you sacrificed to the right gods, takes 2 weeks or less. But that's still a pretty long turnaround time, especially if you have major deadlines that you're pushing up against. Over-the-air updates with React Native mean that you can just ship your code updates whenever you want. And it's still, people are trying to figure out the best and safest ways to do this in production, but there's been a proliferation of attempts to do so. If you need assistance with building a framework to do this easily, Exponent and Code Push are both popular options. Stuff like this starts to crop up all around React Native. Basically, what we see is that because we've got all of these nice, clean ways of separating out different pieces of your app's functionality, we're no longer just thinking in terms of how the iOS platform or how the Android platform encourages you to write apps. It starts to become, okay, so what happens if I can actually write my app however I want? And that's really cool. Again, from Clay Alsop, we have another Medium article. React Native really, really starts to take off. And so this chart is, I think, super interesting. It's a Google Trends chart looking at interest in React Native versus iOS development. And, iOS development surges up after, you can start writing your own iOS apps around 2010, but then stays pretty steady. But React Native has actually surpassed it, which is fascinating to me because I know that mobile development is a place that lots of people come to as their first introduction to programming because they have an idea and they want to make it into reality. Enough people are hearing about React Native that it's actually surpassing that. And this is huge. This means that people are more interested in React Native than they are in traditional development. What do we do with that, right? What are we supposed to make of that? And looking back at the chart I showed you in the beginning of this talk, you can see that time spent on screens, we're talking about mobile, we're talking about desktops and laptops, we're talking about other devices, whether that's your Apple smartwatch or whatever, and also TVs. And now React Native is actually on all of these platforms. You can write React Native for iOS or Android or Windows Phone. You can write it for Xbox. You can write it for smart TVs. You can even use React Native Web to write it for, desktop web, which is sort of an astonishing Ouroboros moment of, wow, like we've come full circle. But this is really great. And it's also worth noting that, just because you can use React Native for all of these things doesn't mean you have to have total code reuse. You can if you want. You're probably not going to want to. But because React Native is flexible enough, you can have, typically 80 to 95% code reuse, and then tailor the rest of it. So now we have a common sort of lingua franca for talking about how we want to build user interfaces and user interactions, how we want to build out our business logic around these applications. We don't have to just think about these as separate silos where, we have to hire dedicated developers to address the needs of every one of these platforms. So that is pretty large. And so if we look at where things are now, people have written bridges that take React Native's representation of things and port them to other platforms. iOS and Android are the ones that are officially supported by the core React Native team. But now we have Microsoft is supporting Windows and Samsung with Tizen. We also have from the open source community React Native Web, which is at this point very robust. My colleague Nicholas Gallagher works on that one. We also have React Native for OS X desktop, for writing desktop applications, which to me is really cool, right? There's no reason why we shouldn't be able to write desktop applications. I think in a lot of ways with the popularity of rich web apps, desktop has sort of fallen to the side, but what if you could take that same skill set and really easily spin up like native apps for OS X or for Windows? This is huge. And so at this point, working with React Native is mostly just like working with React for Web. You write very similar code. You write views instead of divs, and you write images instead of IMG tags. But mostly, it's the same thing. If you don't already know React for Web, you're going to want to know it to learn it before you do React Native work, because you're still going to be using React. It also gives us a standardized styling API. Which is awesome. If you've done work with iOS or Android before and their layout APIs, you probably are not the biggest fan. React Native implements a subset of CSS, which has its pros and cons, but it tries to implement just the amount that you need, keeps you from creating any really terrible foot guns. It uses Flexbox for positioning for almost everything. You can use absolute positioning if you want. But in general, it gives you a very sane, simple styling API. And it means that you only have to learn that one styling API in order to work across all of these platforms. It also gives you native performance and look and feel, because it's actually invoking the underlying API calls, depending on which platform you're on. So you get the same like icon bounces and drawer opening animations and all this stuff that you expect to see on iOS or Android or whatever platform. Which is so nice. You don't have to mimic things in JavaScript. You can choose to mimic animations in JavaScript if you really want to, but for the most part, you're going to want to take advantage of that native level stuff as much as you can. You also get full API access, so that's to stuff like the camera roll or local storage. And even better, you're not limited to what the framework provides you. So if you decide that there's an API that you really need that's not part of React Native Core yet, you can write your own little piece of the bridge, and it's not actually hugely daunting to do so. Incorporating it into your app is actually a very common thing that people end up doing. If you've never done native mobile development before, that might sound a little bit scary, but what if you really want that neat new Bluetooth API or something like that? I include a chapter in my book explaining the basics of how to go about doing that and taking a look at some real code samples that handle this. I think that this is really important because, yes, React Native is a cross-platform mobile framework, but you should be able to understand your tools and you should be able to extend them. Cool. And then the other thing, which is awesome, is that you get this faster development process. So like I said earlier, it's very iterative. You save your code, you look at the simulator. If you have live reload turned on, that's all you have to do. You just save your code and the app instantly refreshes. And then you can check out all of your new stuff. And again, we are now on a ton of different platforms, which means that you're not limited to just your one development silo. So all of this is to say that React Native is a shiny new toy, basically, right? And at this point is definitely ready for production use, which is one of the top questions I get. It offers a really compelling business case over the current status quo. You're going to save way more than 3x the development cost of just eliminating the triplicated effort between Android, iOS, and web. You can actually move a lot faster in React Native, even if your developers are fairly new to it, than you traditionally would on a mobile platform. We're also starting to see some interesting stuff, and this in particular I wanted to dwell on for you folks at CreatorConf, because I think it speaks to some broader trends. So the Angular folks actually ported Angular 2 to work with React Native. This feels a little bit like an everything in the kitchen sink approach, and some people are like, why did you make this awful chimera? But I actually think that this is kind of excellent. So what they did is they took React Native, right, which includes the bridge, and this little blue bit here, the bridge.js APIs, is the React Native portion that translates JavaScript to native code. And they use the React Native renderer, but then they also stuck in the Angular 2 core there and wrote an Angular app. And this is, people ask them like, why on earth would you like put Angular and React? Like that just seems like twice the overhead. Actually, fantastically, I think it's not. React Native doesn't have to be about React. And that's sort of this like little kernel of insight that I think we're going to see a lot more people poke at. You can totally use the React Native JavaScript renderer and then go off and write your JavaScript application however you want. So I think we're going to see more things like this. So that's sort of what's been going on in the world of React Native. It's been 1.5 years since the framework was released. And so now we've got a couple questions. The first one I want to ask is, so what is React Native even at this point? And there's a couple stories that I could tell here. So the first story is one that we used to hear parroted an awful lot. And I think is probably the dominant way that a lot of people look at React Native, which is that React Native is a framework. It lets you build native quality iOS and Android applications with JavaScript and React. This is true. This statement is definitely true. I will stand by the native quality bit. I know a ton of companies that are using React Native in production, shipping it to actual consumers. So this is definitely like, this is the pitch, this is the promise, and I think that it has totally been met. But then we've also got a slightly more complicated story, and which is why I brought up the Angular thing, where React Native sits on top of iOS and Android, yes, but also all of these other platforms, including platforms that don't look anything like mobile, like say your television. And then normally we would put React as the layer on top of React Native, but actually you can really put whatever JavaScript framework you want as long as someone does a little bit of work to port it there. And then you build your application on top of that. So if we look back at, iOS and Android apps with React, how does that fit into this model, right? And the answer is that it doesn't have to. You can use React Native basically just as a lingua franca. This doesn't have to be about mobile development. This doesn't have to be about React specifically. This is a more general design pattern. So the second story that we could tell is that React Native is about neither mobile nor React. And both of these stories are actually true. It's simultaneously React Native is about mobile and React is the core use case, the whole reason why it exists. It's its entire purpose. But it's also about something bigger. So if you look at the React Native website these days, it's very interesting. They've changed their marketing speak. Now they'll tell you that React Native is about developer efficiency. across all the platforms you care about. Learn once, write anywhere. If you handed me a framework that had this tagline, I would look at you and say that I had no idea what it did. Nothing about this tells me that I can use React Native to write excellent iOS and Android apps. Nothing about this tells me that React Native uses JavaScript. And yet I think that this is a pretty clear vision. And I think it's a very admirable vision. React Native is focusing on developer efficiency across platforms. So in other words, it's all the things, right? Which is simultaneously really exciting and also really useless. It's great that we can use React Native everywhere, but why do we care? So a year and a half out, I think that the awesome thing is that React Native has proven the core use case, right? We've definitely seen that you can use it to write excellent mobile apps. It has sort of won in the sense that interest in it is definitely starting to rival interest in traditional iOS and Android development. And now we're starting to think bigger. So we should have great mobile developer experiences. As mobile devs, this is a thing that we should expect to have. But what I think the broader vision of React Native speaks to is that we should be thinking about this in terms of great developer experiences. Just because we're mobile developers doesn't mean that we shouldn't be looking at the broader programming ecosystem. I'm a huge fan of looking at what other people are doing, taking the awesome parts and stealing it. Imitation is a great compliment. And so I think what a lot of this is about is looking outside of your own garden, right? We talk about walled gardens in mobile fairly often. I think that React Native is a good example of saying, hey, what if we weren't all just playing in our own plots of land? What can we do? How much faster can we move if we all actually step outside of that a little bit and get going? So what do we actually need for good mobile developer experiences? There's some stuff that we need, and then there's some stuff that I think is just gravy. It's stuff that might attract to something, but I think it's ultimately a little bit of a distraction. So when it comes to cross-platform application development, I think that goals like 100% code reuse, or getting to use a specific JavaScript framework or a specific way of writing code, things like over-the-air updates, all of these are nice. All of these are wonderful and delicious and stuff that I would love to have. I like using React Native because I like using React. But I think that they ultimately are distractions from sort of what the core appeal of a framework like React Native could be. So, like, what do we actually need when it comes to how we write our code? Native level performance, that's one that we can't compromise on. Remember that mobile is our primary screen. That means it's our primary driver for our customers and our users. So look and feel and animations are actually like very, very core business concerns, right? Your users should be delighted by the things that you give them. We need faster development cycles. So there is a clear payoff to being able to try ideas more quickly, to being able to experiment, add new features, remove features, test things out. This is all stuff that we actually, I think, should consider like a very core concern. And then the one that React Native nails is cross-platform knowledge and principles. So instead of focusing on total code reuse, instead I think that we should focus on building tools that let us take our skills and migrate across platforms. We don't need total code reuse. Maybe 90% is actually enough. And yes, you can get 100% with React Native, but really that's not the point. So I guess a couple takeaways. I think that it's been awesome to watch React Native grow and develop and see it become a tool that solves some serious problems for a lot of people. It is, I think, a hugely useful thing to have. But also, we're not done yet. One thing that I'm hoping to see in the rest of this conference is how people step forward from here. Because there's no actual reason why an approach like React Native needs to be coupled to React, for example. You can substitute in your own JavaScript framework, whatever. There's also no reason why we need to think about this as purely the domain of mobile dev. Now we're talking about more, what if we lifted mobile dev into a world where we had a shared lingua franca? So yeah, there's a lot of work left to be done. I do not think that React Native is going to be the be-all, end-all, and I think that that is excellent. I do not think that React is the final form of the JavaScript framework, and I think that that is excellent. We're going to get to a lot more stuff, and we're going to get to do a lot more. So on that note, I hope that the rest of the conference is going to go awesomely. I am really looking forward to hearing what the rest of people have to say. And thanks. So I'm going to pop over now and answer whatever questions you have in the Q&A section. But also, if you want to follow up with me, I'm on Twitter at @Brindell. And you can find my book at bit.ly/learningreactnative. So thank you.
And now, a brief word from our sponsors before you see the rest of the talk. Raygun. Spend more time building great software and less time fighting it. Raygun helps keep a watchful eye on your web and mobile applications and tells you when problems arise. You can learn more at raygun.com. NativeScript, backed by Telerik by Progress, is an open source framework for building truly native mobile apps with TypeScript and Angular 2. Use your web skills to get native UI and performance on iOS and Android. Enjoy the rest of the talk. All right. Thanks, Bonnie. That was awesome.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
Yeah. All right.
Shall we see what questions we got?
Yeah, definitely. So I'll read them off and ask you, and then you can answer as we're going through them. I'll take my question first. So I'm kind of curious. I didn't mention, but you actually work as an engineer at Twitter, correct?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's correct.
So you mentioned that you had a colleague there that was working on React Native Web, I believe, or working with it. Are you guys using React and React Native? And can you talk about that at all?
Sure. So my colleague actually wrote React Native Web. I think he's possibly the sole contributor of that project, or this main one. So I actually don't do JavaScript stuff at all, or mobile stuff at Twitter. I'm a backend software engineer doing distributed systems, which is always a little bit funny. But Twitter does use React, and pretty seriously. So the mobile web client, you might have noticed, got a total rewrite a few months ago and is now entirely done in React. So that's really great. And then I know there's a couple of teams internally that are assessing whether or not they want to use React Native. The way Twitter approaches new technologies is often that individual teams get a lot of leeway into assessing things and figuring out what they want to use. So
nice.
We'll see.
Awesome. All right. So Ryan asks, what is the status of React Native for Android? How close is it to iOS in terms of functionality and plugins?
Yeah, so that's a great question. React Native Android came out later than iOS by about 6 months. So for a while there was a lag, as a lot of people noticed. At this point, I think that they're pretty much on even footing. There are definitely a few more bugs in the Android version. The build process for apps is a little bit rougher. But I think React Native Android is now at a point where it's absolutely ready for prod. There are definitely a couple of rough spots left, but they are rapidly vanishing. And if you look at the release notes for any of the React Native versions, you'll see that a ton of it is just knocking out feature after feature and bug after bug for Android.
Awesome. All right. So Ahad asked, how versed in React proper do you need to be in order to make the most out of React Native? And I think you answered this a little bit, and there was an addendum in the comments. Do you cover React proper at all in your book, if someone picked that up?
So I don't cover React proper in the book. You don't need to be an expert at React in order to use React Native, but you should be familiar with the basic ideas of what is a component. You should be comfortable with the component lifecycle. You don't need to know stuff like Flux or Redux. And you don't need to be, you don't need a ton of experience with it, but honestly, if you just spend a week going through the basics of what a component is and the component lifecycle, that should be enough to equip you to get started.
Yeah, and if I would say if someone's interested in learning React Native and they don't know React, I would suggest I took Wes Boss's course to kind of get up to snuff with React, and he did a stellar job with that, and it's not too expensive, so I would highly recommend that.
That's great. There's a ton of excellent educational content, whether it's online or in book form or in tutorials or blogs or videos. Egghead has a good video series. There's a ton of stuff out there. When you're working in React Native, keep in mind that you're going to have to be writing a React app and then seeing how it works on mobile. And I think people often underestimate how weird it is to jump to mobile if you've never done it before. So just thinking about things like, oh, wait, I have to like try out all of my touch targets and make sure that they're the right size and all of this stuff. So if you're trying to do it all at once, it's just going to be a little bit overwhelming.
Yeah. Yeah. I remember it can be fun though. I remember working on the Words with Friends project, and I was on the back end. And anytime we'd have like new code going out, we'd have to test it, right? And so like we'd all have to get on our phones and play Words with Friends for like an hour. Pretty fun.
Did you still like the game by the end of that?
Yeah. Still a fun game. Yeah, next question. Have you ever tried Titanium or any of the other cross-platform options to build mobile, or was React Native kind of your first?
So before React Native, first of all, I had done some like traditional iOS and Android development at Google and Fog Creek, respectively. And I've tried Titanium and I've tried Cordova, but honestly, only in terms of like very small tutorial projects, so not enough to feel like I can really speak to them with a ton of authority. I've talked to a lot of people who have done more extensive work with them and have tried to like sort of assess what the general temperature is in terms of how people think about them and talk about them. But yeah, in terms of my hands-on experience, it's mostly just native traditional mobile apps and then React Native.
Nice. All right. So I hope I say this right. Harsha asked, for remote updates, let's say I don't have camera support or any other kind of like native feature in the initial version of the build on the App Store, and later they add camera support, does that require a new update or a build submitted to the App Store?
So if you are just using the standard API that React Native provides for you, which if you're talking about camera API, that should be totally fine. You should not need another App Store review. I think it depends on which permissions your app requested. For some versions of iOS, I believe that you need to specifically request camera permissions. And if you need to update those permissions, then no, I think you should still be fine. Yeah, there's honestly the hardest part about dealing with over-the-air updates is not whether or not Apple will allow you to get it through, but thinking about maintaining every single version you release forever, right? Because if your app is usable offline, you don't necessarily guarantee that someone will always be on the most recent. So you have to sort of decide how long you want to support it for. So you can kind of box yourself into some odd bugs if you're not used to doing continuous deploys, and if you don't already have the workflow set up for that. But in general, yeah, I think as long as you don't have to add any changes to the Objective-C or Java code, you're always good.
Nice. All right. Brent asked, can you use JavaScript libraries like GreenSock with React Native apps to create animations?
Yeah, so absolutely. I don't have any experience with GreenSock specifically, but you can use any JavaScript library as long as it doesn't assume certain things about your environment, right? So I've seen some third-party JavaScript libraries blow up when they try to like access an attribute on the window that doesn't exist because you're not in an actual web browser. So it depends on the implementation details of how that JavaScript animation library is written. There are a bunch of different React Native focused ones. So things like animated or layout animation in the core framework. If you look at, I think, Chenglu's Twitter feed, he usually has a lot of stuff about animation on React Native going on. So that's a good place to start.
Nice, thanks. And Lance had a question. Do you think Apple will continue allowing over-the-air updates in the foreseeable future?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of people ask me this one. So I don't have any special insider insight into Apple's internal workings, and they are sort of famously inscrutable. That being said, I really believe that they're going to leave over-the-air updates intact, in large part because we're starting to see very large and important customers start to use them. As it becomes sort of a necessary thing that people expect to be able to use in their apps, Apple's just not going to break most iPhone apps. They're just not going to do that. I think that they have sort of a complicated relationship with React Native, but on the whole, I think it's very good and positive for the iOS ecosystem. And I don't really see them having an incentive to stop over-the-air updates. If you're worried about your app, I will say that it's always best to sort of, proceed with caution, make it so that your app will continue to function if over-the-air updates don't work. And maybe most importantly, just be a good citizen. If you upload a JavaScript model that changes all of your app's functionality, they're not going to be particularly pleased with that. But otherwise, I think it's as far as these things go, a safe bet.
We'll do Ryan's question first. So he said, regarding your day job, do you work with Scala on the Twitter backend?
Yeah, exactly. So I work on the core services team at Twitter, specifically the user service. We handle all read and write traffic to user data. So it's basically all Scala all the time.
Nice. And maybe that leads me to a question I have. Like, most of the time, if you're building an app using React Native, like, what do you see as like the common backend people are using to kind of like store and push and pull data out of? Any thoughts there?
I think one of the nice parts about React Native is that it's pretty agnostic in terms of that. So a lot of people, when it comes to their backend for their mobile app, they already have a web service up and running somewhere. So it's literally whatever service you already have, right? So people will use it with their Rails app, or people will use it with Meteor, or people will use it with, Firebase, or literally anything. I've seen in terms of on the actual mobile client, like we need a lot more effort put into stuff like databases. We've got Realm and there's some SQLite support, but people are still figuring out how to handle that. But yeah, I've seen a huge range of things. There's no common patterns. It's really often based around what people were already working with.
Yeah. Have you played with GraphQL at all in terms of like using that for a backend perhaps?
Yeah, I have. So GraphQL is sort of, it's not really a backend in and of itself. It's a way of communicating with your backend, and it's a way of structuring your API.
Right.
As a client developer, whether that's for front-end web or for mobile, I think that GraphQL is amazing. It really creates this super, super flexible, set of communication guidelines. As a backend developer, GraphQL is a very interesting challenge, and partially an unsolved problem. Unless you're Facebook, most people don't already have a server up and running that can speak GraphQL and that can speak GraphQL safely, because you're dealing with sort of queries which you don't totally know their structure. So depending on what your backing store is, that may or may not be safe. You might make it really easy for someone to overload you with bad data or bad queries. So I would love to see more people doing work with GraphQL. It's something that I expect to see a lot of experiments with. Very few people have a backend in GraphQL that's just ready to go. So it'll be a little while.
Indeed. All right. And then the last question I actually had is, like, what are your thoughts on building progressive web apps versus React Native? Have you looked at that at all?
Yeah. So I think progressive web apps are really hard. And in general, building great web apps for mobile web or desktop web and just dividing them cleanly between the two, like there's no easy way to do it well because you're handling so many different cases. Personally, I think that usually it's better to have a separate desktop and mobile experience and design very cleanly for both instead of trying to have an experience that transitions well between them. But I think it depends so much on what your app is. So for something like, say, medium.com, where you can see that it's very much like a progressive experience as you like shrink down, as you change sizes, that makes more sense. It's just text versus an application like, say, I don't know, Google Slides, which becomes unusable very quickly when you drop below, say, an 11. So I think it depends.
Yeah.
The boring answer.
Yeah. No, it's good. All right. I think that's it. That was all the questions we had. I want to say thank you, Bonnie. That was pretty awesome. Appreciate you coming on and giving the talk.
Great. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me. It was good talking to you all.
Yeah. All right. And if you do want to talk to Bonnie, she'll be in the Slack chat room, and you can ping her there, or you can find her on Twitter as well. Thanks for watching this CreatorConf talk from the Mobile Edition 2016. For more information about upcoming conferences such as the one in February 2017, go to conf.crator.io to learn more.